is aulitan katar, kan kanahi, ineliv dorkivos an trinert trajecta, agos skavsad for sliv kon wekni ren la konakta. Proratsad tuaha didanan jarum, tjevjul for gren fri re trila, agos trinehi. Kach no rie, konat katar for ferav bolg, thekta kach eturu, kech kach majetureth. Kien dekla dierinj ergnid, kien ekra nengwi, ni fesha fyr for rinjniv, indoniv no induhalwin.
Have you ever heard of the Fermi paradox? If you haven't, it basically states that if there's such a high probability of extraterrestrial life, then where is it? Where's the evidence? And according to sworn testimony to Congress, it seems that it's under this paradox that organizations like ARROW are able to continue to get away with saying that they have found no empirical evidence for claims that the United States government and private companies have been reverse engineering extraterrestrial technology.
The statement ARROW has made is scientific evidence of extraterrestrials. Scientific evidence requires a scientific control. Extraterrestrial is an entity on another planet. The only way to scientifically prove extraterrestrial is we have to go to that planet, acquire technology, bring it back, and compare it to what we have here. And by that statement, ARROW found no scientific evidence of extraterrestrials is basically, I don't want to call it a psyop, but a misrepresentation, because we do have things. But making that statement is not technically a lie, it's a misrepresentation of the full truth.
All that being said, though, I have to admit that the Fermi paradox kind of holds up in its own strange way, because not all of the UFO sightings we have can be clearly categorized as extraterrestrial. And that's where we get to Jacques Vallée's work, because in 1969 he published Passport to Magonia, and it contains, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating theories of the UFO phenomenon. He features UFO landing cases like the 1961 Joe Simonton alien pancake case, where witnesses claim to see human beings piloting these craft and breathing our Earth air. He takes these cases and he compares them to sightings of the fairies in Celtic countries. Though highly controversial, this book has been a trailblazer for people who want to know more about historical UFO cases and the perceptions that our ancestors had of them. I was so curious to learn more that I read a bunch of the books that Vallée referenced in Passport to Magonia, chiefly this one, The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W.Y. Evans Wentz. And as you can see, I've got a lot of bookmarks in here, because together we're going to go deep into the fairy lore and see if these cases can compare with what we know with our modern knowledge of UFOs. But in order to do that, we need to travel back 114 years into the past. My name is JP, and welcome to Realm Travel. So this book was published in 1911 by Wentz, and it's an in-depth, well-researched project into the fairy faith that prevails to this day in places like Ireland, Scotland, Wales, the Isle of Man, Cornwall, France, and Scandinavian countries too. But it's the attitude in this book that I find so refreshing, because it takes in and absorbs testimony from credible people of relatively incredible things without judgment or bias. Because to not do that would be unscientific. If we want to discover or rediscover the hidden world of the fairies, then we'll need to retune ourselves back in line with our primal animistic views of the world around us and reconnect with nature. And not in some social media influencer hollow type of way, but in the profound ways that our ancestors did before us. And luckily, the author of this book has the perfect passage to help us do that.
The great majority of men in cities are apt to pride themselves on their own exemption from superstition and to smile pityingly at the poor countrymen and countrywomen who believe in fairies. But when they do so, they forget that with all their own admirable progress in material invention, with all the far-reaching data of their acquired science, with all the vast extent of their commercial and economic conquests, they themselves have ceased to be natural. The Celtic peasant, who may be their tenant or neighbor, is, if still uncorrupted by them, in direct contrast unconventional and natural. He is normally always responsive to psychical influences, as much so as an Australian Arunta or an American Red Man, who also, like him, are fortunate enough to have escaped being corrupted by what we egotistically, to distinguish ourselves from them, call civilization. If our Celtic peasant has psychical experiences, or if he sees an apparition which he calls one of the good people, that is to say, a fairy, it is useless to try to persuade him that he is under a delusion. Unlike his materialistically minded lord, he would not attempt nor even desire to make himself believe that what he has seen, he has not seen. Not only has he the will to believe, but he has the right to believe, because his belief is not a matter of being educated and reasoning logically, nor a matter of faith and theology. It is a fact of his own individual experiences, as he will tell you. Such peasant seers have frequently argued with me to the effect that one does not have to be educated in order to see fairies.
It cannot be ignored that people who live in harmony with nature can have experiences that those who don't might have a hard time accepting. After all, our last video was all about the 12-day vision of Black Elk, the Lakota holy man. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the Celts are a group of indigenous peoples who were also subjected to genocidal conditions by a spreading empire. And just like the Lakota, the Celts were able to preserve parts of their culture that made them so unique, among them the fairy faith. So now I turn my questions over to you, the viewer. Ask yourself, have you or anyone you know had experiences that you wouldn't want to share online or at work because they just seem too out there, but nevertheless, they're very real to you? If so, then you know what I'm talking about. Before we get into the contents of this book, I think it's really important to highlight the specific details of the 1961 Joe Simonton case, just for your benefit.
Where do you meet someone from outer space? Perhaps in the North Wood. Joe Simonton of Eagle River, Wisconsin, spins a yarn about an April morning in 1961. A morning when, he says, he came face to face with another world.
Right here is where this flying saucer, this UFO landed. Right here about where I'm standing. And it was a big, huge thing, and I wondered what the heck it was. I was in my kitchen having a bite of lunch, and I turned around, put the dishes in the sink, and I looked out the window, and that's when I first saw this thing coming straight down, just like an elevator. And first I thought the roof went off of my house, and I thought, no, the roof is green, and this is bright. What the heck is it? So I rushed out to see what it was, and by that time, there was a hatchway opening up in the top of it, just like the trunk of your car.
In 1961, Joe Simonton was just finishing up his breakfast when he says a flying saucer came down vertically and hovered over his driveway. Then he says a hatch opened up in this saucer, and a man resembling an Italian in a black two-piece suit and black knit cap leaned out, holding a silvery jug, and motioned for water.
And then there stood a little man, I say a little man, about 5 foot tall, holding up a jug or a container, and he motioned, he wanted to drink. He motioned for water. So I walked up to him to get this jug, and I looked at his eyes, and they were so penetrating that I had to look away.
So Joe took this silvery jug and filled it at his basement pump. He brought it back to the craft and gave it to the man. And he stood there for a while and leaned against this saucer because he was just like, what the heck is going on? And He looked inside of the saucer that was the color of wrought iron and had control panels in it, that one of the other beings was cooking pancakes on a, quote, flameless grill. And because nobody was saying anything, Joe motioned to eat.
He was frying these pancakes, and I pointed to him and made a gesture like eating. I thought maybe I'd get a conversation out of him. Nobody was saying anything. But he didn't say a word. He just reached over and he got a handful of them, 4 of them, and he handed them down to me. And they were hot and greasy. And this man cooking these pancakes, it was on a square grill-like concern. I couldn't see any flame, but it seemed to be very hot. There was smoke coming from it. And if that was their food, God help them, because I took a bite of one of them and it tasted like a piece of cardboard. And if that's what they lived on, no wonder they're small.
Then they closed the hatch and the flying saucer took off at an impressive speed. This case seems completely ludicrous, and I'll admit that, but I'm going to lay out these 3 details. 1, the beings asked for pure water. 2, they were cooking buckwheat pancakes. And 3, to Joe, they resembled Italians. That's something that you might not expect to see from what you would imagine would be an extraterrestrial. But I'm going to take these details and address them as we go along through the video.
Did you know that yanking on a dog's leash can actually be quite painful for the dog's throat? And for strong dogs that like to pull on the leash all the time, that can make walking unpleasant for both of you. Luckily, the sponsor of this video, Compadre, is here to make sure you love every walk. Compadre has developed the patented no-pull solution, a humane harness and leash system to help train against pulling and lunging behaviors. Compadre believes that you don't have to hurt a dog or break their beautiful spirit in order to get them to be good citizens on a leash. The no-pull solution uses gentle corrections around the strongest parts of a dog's anatomy, the chest, which means that you can guide and train your dog without painful pinch collars, e-collars, or choke chains. This system helps you to gain your dog's attention and lead them to walk calmly beside you. Now with Compadre's no-pull solution, both dogs and humans have a clear line of communication. No more pulling, love every walk. So head over to compadre.com to check this out for yourself. That's www.compadre.com. And if you use promo code JPT2025, you can get 10% off of your order. Thank you, Compadre, for sponsoring this video. Now back to the show.
Okay, so now we can get back to fairies. And when it comes to fairies, what I want you to do is take that image of Tinkerbell and throw it out the window. Because the word fairy encompasses a vast range of beings. And in Ireland, for example, they refer to them as the good people or the gentry, but a more mythological general term for them is the Touchette de Danann. The name Touchette de Danann, which translates to the folk of the goddess Danu, are a supernatural race of beings in the Irish pantheon of mythology, and they are said to be highly skilled in the arts. So much so that their eventual conquerors, the Milesians, regarded them as magicians.
Irish people, through their veneration for the good Saint Bridget, render homage to the divine mother of the people who bear her name, Dana, who are the ever-living invisible fairy people of modern Ireland. For when the sons of Mill, the ancestors of the Irish people, came to Ireland, they found the Touchette de Danann in full possession of the country. The Touchette de Danann then retired before the invaders without, however, giving up their sacred island, assuming invisibility with the power of at any time reappearing in a human-like form before the children of the sons of Mill. The people of the goddess Dana became and are the fairy folk, the she of Irish mythology and romance. Therefore it is that today Ireland contains 2 races, a race visible which we call Celts, and a race invisible which we call fairies. Between these 2 races there is constant intercourse even now, for Irish seers say that they can behold the majestic, beautiful she, and according to them the she are a race quite distinct from our own, just as living and possibly more powerful. These she, who are the gentry of the Ben Bulben country and have kindred elsewhere in Ireland, Scotland, and probably in most other countries as well, such as the invisible races of the Yosemite Valley, have been described more or less accurately by our peasant seer witnesses from County Sligo and from North and East Ireland.
But the origins of the Touchette are ancient, murky, and frankly hard for my little ADHD brain to comprehend. But so far, I've managed to find this in the Book of the Taking of Ireland.
In this wise they came, without vessels or barks, in dark clouds over the air, by the might of druidry, and they landed on a mountain of Conwach-na-Rain in Connachtha. Another company says that the Touchette came in a sea expedition and that they burnt their ships thereafter. It was owing to the fog of smoke that rose from them as they were burning that others have said that they came in a fog of smoke. Not so, however, for these are the two reasons why they burnt their ships: that the Fomarig should not find them to rob them of them, and that they themselves should have no way of escape from Ireland, even though they should suffer rout before the Firbolg. Thereafter the Touchette brought a darkness over the sun, for a space of 3 days and 3 nights.
These Milesians eventually defeated the Touchette, and among them it was Amergin Whiteknee, the bard, who was tasked with dividing Ireland between the two races. He gave the above ground to the Milesians and the underground to the Touchette, who are said to have received immortality and retreated into a spiritual realm under the hills of Ireland where they, quote, have enjoyed ever since never-ending bliss. So now that we've established at least some of the fairy lore, we can get down to some of the nitty-gritty stuff. Going back to Joe Simonton's case in 1961, we find that some of the most distinctive parts of it are that these beings asked for pure water and gave him 4 buckwheat pancakes. And if we look at the fairy faith in Celtic countries, we find that both pure water and cakes, or pancakes, are a recurring theme. Up the airy mountain, down the rushy glen, we daren't go a-hunting for fear of little men. Wee folk, good folk, trooping all together, green jacket, red cap, and white owl's feather. Down along the rocky shore, some make their home. They live on crispy pancakes of yellow tide foam. Some in the reeds of the Black Mountain Lake, with frogs for their watchdogs all night awake.
A pretty legend about magic buckwheat cakes, which in different forms is widespread throughout all Brittany, is told of these little cave-dwelling fairies. Like the larger fae, the Fillon kept cattle, and one day a black cow belonging to the Fillon of Pontozomne ate the buckwheat in the field of a woman of that neighborhood. The woman went to the Fillon to complain, and in reply to her a voice said, "Hold your tongue, you will be paid for your buckwheat." Thereupon the Fillon gave the woman a cupful of buckwheat and promised her that it would never diminish so long as none should be given away. That year buckwheat was very scarce, but no matter how many buckwheat cakes the woman and her family ate, there was never diminution in the amount of the fairy buckwheat. At last, however, the unfortunate hour came. A rag gatherer arrived and asked for food. Thoughtlessly, the woman gave him one of her buckwheat cakes, and suddenly, as though by magic, all the rest of the buckwheat disappeared forever. Mrs. Dina Moore near Glen May, Isle of Man, had this story to tell. At night, the fairies came into a house in Glen Rushen to bake. The family had put no water out for them, and a beggar man who had been left lodging on the sofa downstairs heard the fairies say, "We have no water, so we'll take blood out of the toe of the servant who forgot our water." And from the girl's blood they mixed their dough. Then they baked their cakes, ate most of them, and poked pieces up under the thatched roof. The next day the servant girl fell ill, and was ill until the old beggar man returned to the house and cured her with a bit of the cake which he had took from under the thatch.
Now you might be thinking that these stories about buckwheat and water are coincidental, and on their own it does seem coincidental, and they don't address lights in the sky or flying saucers. But if we look deeper into this book and just look for similarities, we find that there are plenty when it comes to death candles or aerial beings.
In Pembrokeshire, Wales, a maiden of 60 years old who spoke no English recounted this magnificent story about death candles. I saw one death candle right here in this room where we are sitting and talking. I was told by the nephew and niece of our present witness that this particular death candle took an untrodden course from the house across the fields to the graveyard, and that when the death of one of the family occurred soon afterwards, their aunt insisted that the corpse should be carried by exactly the same route. So the road was abandoned and the funeral went through the plowed fields. Here is the description of the death candle as the aunt gave it in response to our request. The death candle appears like a patch of bright light, and no matter how dark the room or place is, everything in it is as clear as day. The candle is not a flame but a luminous mass, lightish blue in color, which dances as though borne by an invisible agency, and sometimes it rolls over and over. If you go up to the light, it is nothing, for it is a spirit. Near here, a light as big as a pot was seen, and rays shot out from it in all directions. The man you saw here in the house today, one night as he was going along the road near Nevern, saw the death light of old Dr. Harris, and says it was lightish green. In the Isle of Man, a witness by the name of Mr. T.C. Kermode, member of the House of Keys, the lower house of the Manx Parliament, had this to share with Wentz. About 40 years ago, one October night, I and another young man were going to a kind of Manx harvest home at Cronkavati, on the Glen Helen Road just at the Berry Farm. As we walked along talking, my friend happened to look across the river and said, "Oh look, there are the fairies. Did you ever see them?" I looked across the river and saw a circle of supernatural light, which I have now come to regard as the astral light, or the light of nature as it is called by mystics, and in which spirits become visible. The spot where the light appeared was a flat space surrounded on the sides away from the river by banks formed by low hills, and into the space and the circle of light from the surrounding sides apparently, I saw come in twos and threes a great crowd of little beings, smaller than Tom Thumb and his wife. All of them, who appeared like soldiers, were dressed in red. They moved back and forth amid the circle of light as they formed into order like troops drilling. I advised getting nearer to them, but my friend said, "No, I'm going to the party." Then after we had looked at them a few minutes, my friend struck the roadside wall with a stick and shouted, and we lost the vision and the light vanished. To another of my fellow students in Oxford, a native Irishman of County Kerry, I am indebted for the following evidence. Some few weeks before Christmas 1910, at midnight on a very dark night, I and another young man who, like myself, was then about 23 years of age, were on horseback on our way home from Limerick. When near Listowel, we noticed a light about a half a mile ahead. At first it seemed to be no more than a light in some house, but as we came nearer to it and it was passing out of our direct line of vision, we saw that it was moving up and down, to and fro, diminishing to a spark, then expanding into a yellow luminous flame. Before we came to Listowel, we noticed two lights, about 100 yards to our right, resembling the light seen first. Suddenly, each of these lights expanded into the same sort of yellow luminous flame, about 6 feet high by 4 feet broad. In the midst of each flame, we saw a radiant being having human form. Presently, the lights moved toward one another and made contact, whereupon the two beings in them were seen to be walking side by side. The beings' bodies were formed by a pure, dazzling radiance, white like the radiance of the sun, and much brighter than the yellow light or aura surrounding them. So dazzling was the radiance like a halo round their heads that we could not distinguish the countenances of the beings. We could only distinguish the general shapes of their bodies, though their heads were clearly outlined because this halo-like radiance, which was the brightest light about them, seemed to radiate from or rest upon the head of each being. It was the first time we had ever seen such phenomena, and in our hurry to get home, we were not wise enough to stop and make further examination. But ever since that night, I have frequently seen, both in Ireland and in England, similar lights with spiritual beings in them. In Wales, Mr. David Williams, Justice of the Peace, gives his understanding and stories about the Tylwyth Teg. The general idea, as I remember it, was that the Tylwyth Teg were only visitors to this world and had no terrestrial habitations. They were as small in stature as dwarfs and always appeared in white. Often at night they danced in rings amid green fields, Most of them were females, though they had a king, and as their name suggests, they were very beautiful in appearance. The king of the Tylwyth Teg was called Gwydion Abdon, Gwyd referring to a temperament in man's nature. His residence was among the stars, and called Caer Gwydion. His queen was Gwenhwydo. I have heard my mother call the small fleece-like clouds which appear in fine weather the sheep of Gwenhwydo. As aerial beings, the Tylwyth Teg could fly and move about in the air at will. They were a special order of creation. I never heard that they grew old, and whether they multiplied or not, I cannot tell. In character, they were almost always good.
So reading these stories, it immediately made me think of blue and green orbs being seen by pilots leading back all the way to the 1950s. Even Luis Elizondo in the book Imminent writes that blue and green orbs would be seen at his property when he was studying the phenomenon. And in the OSAP and ATIP programs, they seem to correlate human health conditions with blue orbs in particular. Next, we arrive to one of the other major things that makes Simonton's case so unique. It's the fact that the beings in the craft to him resembled Italians. Now, here's a passage from a pamphlet issued to the LaPorte, Indiana subcommittee by Simonton himself. Belts or cables were hooked at men's sides. Men were dressed in black two-piece suits, no visible buttons or zippers. Turtleneck sweaters. Feet weren't in sight. Caps fit low to ears or eyebrows. Men were about 5 feet tall, 120 pounds, looked Italian. Swarthy? About 25 to 30 years old, white stripe down sides of trousers, on man who gestured for water.
What do these men look like? Well, they look like Italian. What they look like, they were about 5 foot tall, 120 pounds, I presume, and they were wearing a black, dirty looking clothes. You know what I mean? The kind of nuts, two-piece outfit, turtleneck, no buttons, and they had a form-fitting cap on like if they wore a helmet over it sometimes. Now, these other two men didn't even look at me. One was at the instrument board. I seen him holding the ship there. He didn't even turn around. He stayed right there. One cooking these things, he stayed at his post. Well, they look like normal human beings. Normal human beings. Their eyes were just like ours, their hands, their arms, everything. Except the height. The height was white, only, sort of dark complexion, like I tell you.
These specific details led me to scour Wentz's Fairy Faith book to look for anything to have to do with this, specifically beings that might look like they have darker complexions. And this is what I found.
Mr. Henry Mattern, FIAS, an architect in Penzance, Cornwall, had this to say about piskies. In general appearance, the fairies were much the same as pixies. They were small men and women, much smaller than dwarfs. The men were swarthy in complexion, and the women had a clear complexion of a peach-like bloom. None ever appeared to be more than 5 and 20 to 30 years old. I have heard my nurse say that she could see scores of them whenever she picked a 4-leaf clover, and put in the wisp of straw which she carried on her head as a cushion for the bucket of milk. Her theory was that the richness of the milk was what attracted them.
So there does seem to be a belief in Celtic countries that pixies or fairies had darker complexions. But if the similarities between fairies and UFOs ended there, I don't think I would be making this video. Here we're getting to a section that I am really excited to share because of knowledge that we now have. And this is the connection to the water. Now, for those UFO nerds out there like me, you may be familiar with the Art Bell coast-to-coast caller that was claiming to be a Marine Corps lieutenant colonel that was part of a DSRV, Deep Sea Recovery Vehicle Unit, and recovered a triangular-shaped craft with hieroglyphics on it.
I was assigned or requested to join this DSRV unit and did, and was reassigned to Virginia. And basically what we did was deep sea rescue and recovery. If we had a downed aircraft, we would go and try to rig the craft to get it back. Any anomaly that we wanted to look at, basically we were sent. There were several teams that did the same thing we did. The particular incident we were involved in, we were just under 1.5 miles of water, North Atlantic. What had happened, they had picked up there's a survey vehicle working the North Atlantic that had picked up some radioactive signal. And we were brought out from Virginia, steamed out, and not to give you specific minutes, seconds, location, just approximately 250 miles out of Aberdeen, Scotland is where we were. You can draw a circle and narrow it down pretty quick. And we contacted the vessel, which we immediately recognized not as a submarine, but more of an aircraft. This particular vessel was partially in the mud, submerged or buried under some mud, had been there for some period of time. What we saw was I would say the rear 2/3. It was a triangular shape. It was wedged more.
Triangular
shape. And best way I could describe it, it would be nose down with about 2/3 exposed to the back.
Yes, sir.
And as you come out the triangular shape, at the back it was rounded. My comment was, I don't believe it's Russian. And his comment was, if it is, it's not Russia right now. The best way I can describe it, it was a charcoal gray in color, and there were markings on the side of it, which were in the skin itself.
And how would you describe those markings?
And I've heard this before. People try to say hieroglyphics and all of this. It was not any language or marking which we would typically see, Russian, Arabic, nothing we were trained or had seen previously.
But hieroglyphic light.
Well, I'll say hieroglyphic light, but more geometric patterns.
And that case has been deeply researched by one of my favorite creators, UAP Gerb. And it's his opinion that recovery took place in Rockall Trough. Now, where is Rockall Trough, you might ask? Very close off of the west coast of Ireland and Scotland. Very interesting. If that story is true, then it would make a lot of sense why there are so many stories of fairies living under the water.
Monsieur Paul Sebiot records from Upper Brittany a tradition that beneath the sea waves, there one can see a subterranean world containing fields and villages and beautiful castles, and it is so pleasant a world that mortals going there find years no longer than days. And this story, given by a Manx scholar John Nelson, highlights the behavior of Manannán mac Lir, the sea god which the Irish also share a belief in. Mr. Nelson told a story about a bugan, or fenogeri, such as we already have, and explained the glashtin as a water bull, supposed to be a goblin half cow and half horse, and then offered this tradition about Manannán. It is said that Manannán was a great magician, and that he used to place on the sea pea shells held open with sticks, and with sticks for masts standing up in them, and then so magnify them that enemies beheld them as a strong fleet, and would not approach the island. Another tradition is that Manannán on his 3 legs, the Manx coat of arms, could travel to one end of the other of his isle with wonderful swiftness, moving like a wheel. In a different book entitled Fairy and Folktales of Ireland by W.B. Yeats, I found a tale called The Lady of Gallerus, about a man named Dick Fitzgerald who saw a murrow, or a sea fairy. She's described as a beautiful young creature combing her hair, which is of a sea green color, and now the salt water shining on it appeared in the morning light like melted butter upon cabbage. Then Dick spied something lying beside her, which I find quite curious given the circumstances of this video. The cochulín drich, which roughly translates to a hood, cap, or coif that fits closely on the head. This magical cap has a special significance because without it, the murrow would lose the power to return under the sea. But Dick, who was awfully lonely for a wife, quickly seized this cap and convinced the murrow to marry him. They had several children together and lived a happy life, for the murrow's father was the king of the sea, which brought them many possessions for their home. But one day when Dick was out of town, she found her cochulín drich in its hiding spot in the home. And being homesick, went back to the sea, never to return. And Dick Fitzgerald never married again, and waited for her until the end of his days. She was such a good wife to him that she became a legend among the Irish. In Grange, Ireland, a tailor by the name of Patrick Waters told Wentz this story. There is an enchanted island which is an invisible island between Inishmurray and the mainland opposite. It is only seen once in 7 years. I saw it myself, and so did 4 or 5 others with me. A boatman from Sligo named Carr took 2 strange men with him towards Inishmurray, and they disappeared at the spot where the island is, and he thought they had fallen overboard and been drowned. Carr saw one of the same men in Connolly, County Donegal, some 6 months or so after, and with great surprise said to him, "Will you tell me the wonders of the world? Is it you I saw drowned near Inishmurray?" "Yes," he said, and then asked, "Do you see me?" "Yes," answered Carr. "But," said the man again, "you do not see me with both eyes." Then Carr closed one eye to be sure, and found that he saw him with one eye only, and he told the man which one it was. At this information the ferryman blew on Carr's face, and Carr never saw him again.
This Irish legend of the dead is given by Bridget O'Connor, Patrick Waters' neighbor in Clontypruchilish. Old Peggy Gillen, dead these 30 years, who lived a mile beyond Grange, used to cure people with a secret herb shown to her by her brother, dead of a fairy stroke. He was drowned and taken by the fairies in the big drowning here in the herring season. She would pull the herb herself and prepare it by mixing spring water with it. Peggy could always talk with her dead relatives and friends, and continually with her brother, and she would tell everybody that they were with the fairies. For those of you who are familiar with Whitley Strieber, author of Communion, you may remember that some people who visited his home would see their dead relatives walking around on his property. And we can't forget Chris Bledsoe, who would see luminous objects hovering over right where his wife tragically passed away in a car accident. He also saw angelic self-luminous beings that we've covered in fairy stories so far. This made me curious as to how the Celts contended with spirits coming in and out of the world of the living. And later on in the book by Wentz, there's a reference to the Welsh Bardas that allow this to happen.
There are 3 circles of existence. The circle of Cegant, the circle of infinity, where there is neither animate nor inanimate save God, and God only can traverse it. The circle of Abred, the circle of rebirth, where the dead is stronger than the living, and where every principal existence is derived from the dead, and man has traversed it. And the circle of Gwynfud, the circle of the white, i.e. the circle of perfection, where the living is stronger than the dead, and where every principal existence is derived from the living and life, that is, from God. And man shall traverse it, nor will man attain to perfect knowledge, until he shall have fully traversed the circle of Gwynfud. For no absolute knowledge can be obtained but by the experience of the senses, from having borne and suffered every condition and incident. The 3 stabilities of knowledge, to have traversed every state of life, to remember every state and its incidents, and to be able to traverse every state as one would wish for the sake of experience and judgment, and this will be obtained in the circle of Gwynfud.
There's also the legend of Loch Gur, which combines this rebirth doctrine and another odd similarity to UFOs.
The Loch Gur legend is about Garret Fitzgerald, the Earl of Desmond, who rebelled against Queen Elizabeth. Modern folk tradition regards him as the guardian deity of the loch, and as dwelling in an enchanted palace situated beneath its waters. As Count John de Salis, whose ancestral home is the Loch Gur estate, assures me, the peasants of the region declare themselves convinced that the Earl once in 7 years appears riding across the lake's surface on a phantom white horse shod with shoes of silver, and they believe that when the horse's silver shoes are worn out, the enchantment will end. Then, like Arthur, when his stay in Avalon ends, Garret Fitzgerald will return to the world of human life again to lead the Irish hosts to victory.
That phantom white horse from that legend immediately makes me think of Range 4 Harry that Charles Hall described in Walking with the Tall Whites.
The legend of Range 4 Harry was that there was this giant white radioactive horse that floated around the ranges at night and was fluorescent, and supposedly was a horse that had gotten too close to the bomb blast at Yucca Flats, and you'd see him on warm summer nights from a distance, and you could stay, but you needed to stay away from him. and he was called Range 4 Harry.
If we really wanted to look at the jumbled and entangled accounts of both UFOs and fairies and force them into a spiritual or mythological mold, then maybe that three-circle system could provide some sort of explanation. After all, Simonton's beings that he saw didn't seem to be fazed whatsoever by the interaction. Everything was nonchalant and friendly. But to me, this isn't enough of an explanation. One of the most common side effects that comes along with being in contact with UFOs or people who claim to have been abducted is missing time, including John Blitch, who I had on my podcast many months ago. And sure enough, that theme of missing time is probably one of the most recurring themes in the fairy faith.
Here we have the story of the abduction of a bridge groom from Murdoch MacLean in Barra, Scotland. I have heard it from old people that a couple, newly married, were on their way to the home of the bride's father, and for some unknown reason the groom fell behind the procession, and seeing a fairy dwelling open along the road was taken into it. No one could ever find the least trace of where he went, and all hope of seeing him again was given up. The man remained with the fairies so long that when he returned, 2 generations had disappeared during the lapse of time. The township in which his bride's house used to be was depopulated and in ruins for upwards of 20 years, but to him, the time had seemed only a few hours, and he was just as fresh and youthful as when he went into the fairy dwelling.
And speaking of abductions, this is probably one of the most commonly mentioned things in this book, more than any of the other connections that we've covered so far. If you go to the index of this book, abductions of animals is mentioned 4 times, and abductions of people is mentioned almost 40 times.
This Scotch Protestant minister gave his testimony based on his own knowledge of the fairy faith. An elder in my church knew a woman who was accustomed, in milking her cows, to offer libations to the fairies. The woman was later converted to Christ and gave up the practice, and as a result, one of her cows was taken by the fairies. Then she revived the practice.
Over and over again, we see stories of fairies that are jealous of brides or bridge grooms, or fairies that will take babies if mothers are not careful.
Here we have a story on the nature of fairies given by a 96-year-old piper, Donald McKinnon, in Barra, Scotland. I believe that the fairies exist as a tribe of spirits and appear to us in the form of men and women. People who saw fairies can yet describe them as they appeared dressed in green. No doubt there are fairies in other countries as well as here. In my experience, there was always a good deal of difference between the fairies and the hosts. The fairies were supposed to be living without material food, whereas the hosts were supposed to be living upon their own booty. Generally, the hosts were evil and the fairies were good, though I have heard that the fairies used to take cattle and leave their old men rolled up in the hides. One night an old witch was heard to say to the fairies outside the fold, "We cannot get anything tonight." The old men who were left behind in the hides of the animals taken usually disappeared very suddenly. I saw 2 men who used to be lifted by the hosts. They would be carried from southwest as far as Barra Head and as far north as Harris. Sometimes when these men were ordered by the hosts to kill men on the road, they would kill instead either a horse or a cow. For in that way, so long as an animal was killed, the injunction of the hosts was fulfilled. Back in Ireland, a Galway piper gives his opinion on fairies, or Sheoga. According to our next witness, Stephen Ruan, a piper of Galway, with whom I have often talked, there is one class of fairies who are nobody else than the spirits of men and women who once lived on Earth. And the banshee is a dead friend, relative, or ancestor who appears to give a warning. The fairies, he says, never care about old folks. They only take babies and young men and young women. If a young wife dies, she is said to have been taken by them, and ever afterwards to live in fairyland. The same things are said about a young man or a child who dies. Fairyland is a place of delights, where music and singing and dancing and feasting are continually enjoyed, and its inhabitants are all about us, as numerous as the blades of grass.
So wrapping this video up, it does refreshingly seem like Wentz's conclusion is that he could eliminate social psychology as an explanation for these experiences. And yeah, when hallucinations, lies, and hearsay can also be eliminated, then there's not a whole lot of other explanations left to contend with. Now, that's quite the claim. And since I'm no academic, I'll leave it for you to ponder whether that's accurate or simply an artifact of a more superstitious time. I don't know. Nevertheless, there were quite a lot of serious academics looking deep into psychical forces. And Wentz quotes another one of his colleagues, Monsieur Flammarion, here.
Two inescapable hypotheses present themselves. Either it is we who produce these phenomena, and this is not reasonable, or it is spirits. But mark this well, these spirits are not necessarily the souls of the dead. For other kinds of spiritual beings may exist, and space may be full of them without our ever knowing anything about it, except under unusual circumstances. Do we not find in the different ancient literatures demons, angels, gnomes, goblins, sprites, specters, elementals, etc.? Perhaps these legends are not without some foundation in fact.
As for the Jacques Vallée pathway, the research I've done for this particular video has made me wonder if something deeper than just extraterrestrial visitation is going on here. But these stories I've shared with you today are just tiny little windows into the beliefs that cultures all over the world have. There are so many indigenous cultures that have, you could call, fairy faiths that are adjacent to the ones in Celtic countries. And I'm far from done with this topic on this channel, mainly because I'm left with more questions than answers. Is the phenomenon changing over time? Or are there different phenomena? Or are we interpreting the phenomenon differently based on our cultural zeitgeists? This also really makes me want to know if the UFO phenomenon has some sort of mythological reality to it. As in, can some cultural beliefs actually explain what we're seeing? There's some allusion to this when it comes to simply the fairy faith that Wentz says here.
The logical corollary to the rebirth doctrine and an integral part of the Celtic esoteric theory of evolution is that there have been human races like the present human race who in past eons of time have evolved completely out of the human plane of conscious existence into the divine plane of conscious existence. Hence, the gods are beings which once were men, and the actual race of men will in time become gods. Man now stands related to the divine and invisible world in precisely the same manner that the brute stands related to the human race. To the gods, man is a being in a lower kingdom of evolution. According to the complete Celtic belief, the gods can and do enter the human world for the specific purposes of teaching men how to advance most rapidly toward the higher kingdom. In other words, all the great teachers, Jesus, Buddha, Zoroaster, and many others, in different ages and among various races, whose teachings are extant, are, according to a belief yet held by educated and mystical Celts, divine beings who in inconceivably past ages were men but who are now gods, able at will to incarnate into our world in order to emphasize the need which exists in nature, by virtue of the working of evolutionary laws, to which they themselves are still subject, for man to look forward and to strive to reach divinity rather than to look backward in evolution, and thereby fall into mere animalism. The stating of this mystical corollary makes the exposition of the fairy faith complete, at least in outline.
Can mythology be an accurate explanation for what we are seeing with UFOs? I really don't know, but it's hard to come to terms with when I'm confronted with the same patterns across history, and the indigenous cultures being so sure of what it is. I'm not certain, but I just find this fascinating. I want to be totally clear here. This book that I mainly covered today doesn't talk about UFOs as we talk about them. And I do think that there's some sort of Venn diagram when it comes to this. On one side being the Celtic fairies, the other side being UFOs. They're both their distinctive phenomenon, but there's plenty of overlap. I would love to see how that Venn diagram changes over time with actual scientific study, but There's no clear-cut answer here. Now, of course, these similarities are just similarities until the alleged legacy program gatekeepers are forced to come out with some more knowledge and more disclosure, specifically about the origins of the beings that they may be possessing. We don't know. But until then, all we have are the UFO reports and humanity's vast materials on things like psychical forces, and we can put these breadcrumbs together in preparation for disclosure that might come in the future. Finally, I'm going to leave you with the words of this guy.
One of the things that attracted me to what people call esotericism or occultism, now for me about 45 years ago, was cosmic fire. And it was because of the point that you have to be, as we say, an occultist, but you also have to be a mystic. From your heart, from your head, the mind.
Who do you think that was? Was that at a yoga retreat? Or was that done through the History Channel? No. That was Jim Ryder, former vice president of Lockheed Martin. Why was Jim Ryder and a bunch of other aerospace high-level individuals interested in esotericism and mysticism?
Are any of you willing to name specific gatekeepers within the root cell of the UAP-SAP Federation?
You mean specific people and contractors that have dealt with us and kept the secret?
Specific individuals.
Well, one of them was named Dr. James Ryder at Lockheed. But, you know, again, to emphasize, I don't fault these contractors for doing what they were asked to do by our government. They're supposed to lie if people ask about it. And the intelligence agencies who gave this stuff to them, CIA, I think primarily, told them to keep it quiet, and they've done that. And I suspect that they'd like an off-ramp, that they'd like some help with figuring out this technology at some point.
But there's one thing I can say for sure, and trust me, that's going to be a rare thing on this channel. But I think that if there are certain cultures out there that firmly believe that they need to propitiate supernatural beings that are custodians of nature and the land, and who punish those who don't respect the land, then maybe that has a net impact on the environment. And as far as I'm concerned, in this video, I think that's just fine and dandy. But anyways, if you've come this far throughout the video, thank you so much. I'm just starting out on my channel, and if you enjoyed this video at all, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you're notified whenever I drop a new video. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time on the next episode of Realm Travel.